So we are recording on a lovely sunny afternoon here in London. George, though, I can see the sun coming through the window. It is dawn where you are, I think I'm right.
I am like Cortez in the famous poem, staring at the Pacific. I am in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And I'm here in California all week teaching my course in Stanford, which is in Northern California near San Francisco. But I have come down to LA to see some people for a day or two. And there's something about being here with the sunshine and the sea. It's kind of lifts the spirits.
And you're almost certainly doing some door knocking for Steve Hilton on the campaign trail, if I had to guess.
I did. I went to see Steve, future Governor Steve, and I saw his battle truck, which is painted bright yellow. It's a sort of pickup, Steve Hilton for governor, and I will put a photo of me and Steve next to the battle truck into the newsletter which we send our kitchen cabinet subscribers.
Did you bump into your mate JD Vance?
No, you see, he's now the vice president, in case you haven't noticed. I'm not sure he's on this Middle East trip or he's holding the fort in Washington.
Too busy running amok. Well, I've had a much kind of quieter and less glamorous week. I've actually spent the last 48 hours with a range of Bank of England and Treasury guys you'll know. On Monday, at the King's College London Bank Watchers Conference, I did an interview with Alan Taylor, the new MPC member, the guy who voted for a half-point cut last week when we reported on the quarter-point cut. So he's leading the way as an external member. Then yesterday I went to a celebratory conference at LSE, London School of Economics, for Sushil Wadhwani, who was also one of the early leading MPC members. And then last night I went down to the Treasury and a colleague of ours, both of us from the past, Mario Pisani, was doing a lecture. I teach with him on our King's course on the history of the Treasury building over the last 1,000 years. Brilliant lecture he did. He was doing it for staff at the Treasury today. The very exciting thing is Mario has finally located the office in which John Maynard Keynes sat during the Second World War. He was an unpaid advisor to the wartime chancellors between 1940 and I think 1946. And but they found his office. And I mean, I could describe it to you, George. It may be quite boring for our listeners, but they found where Keynes sat.
Yeah, what about Keynes's original office when he was a Treasury official after the First World War, where he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace? Because I think that's the really brave Keynes, isn't he? He's like an official, and he sort of puts a big black mark against the Treaty of Versailles. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm going to say I wouldn't actually swap your week for mine. I mean, I'm sure it's been fun doing the King's College thing and going back to the Treasury, but I've been California dreaming over here.
I'm sure you will. Anyway, we should get on with it.
Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about, haven't we? So we're going to start with the government's immigration white paper. Lots of chunky policy there. Labour's big throw of the dice on this big controversial issue in British politics, but also the row that has followed around the language that Keir Starmer used when he said, "Were we becoming an island of strangers?"
Then Donald Trump is out in the Middle East. It seems not doing peace deals. He's not even going to Israel. Instead, defence deals, talking to Saudi Arabia, Qatar he is today. Seems to be procuring himself an aeroplane in the process. And we'll be asking, what does it tell us about the Trump presidency, this Middle East trip?
Yeah, there's certainly been inflation in gifts, isn't it? There used to be a time when you just handed over a book or a little statuette or something when you went on a foreign trip. Now you get given Air Force One when you turn up. But we're going to start with the immigration white paper. So this was a big, chunky announcement from Yvette Cooper, your other half, the Home Secretary, on Monday, fronted by the Prime Minister, in which the government set out a whole range of things it would do to essentially tighten immigration controls for the legal migration coming into the country. There was not that much said about illegal migration in the small boats. This was all about the legal routes. And there were a whole set of announcements, weren't there, about, for example, we won't go through them all on the podcast, but raising to a degree level the kind of skills you needed if you wanted to come in through the work route, closing down the route for people who come to work in the care sector, in looking after elderly people and the like in care homes. There was an extension of the time it takes that you need to be in this country before you can get indefinite leave to remain and British citizenship, and that goes from 5 years to 10 years. There was a requirement on dependents, as family members who are coming into the country, to be able to speak English, which has been a cause of much kind of controversy over recent years. And indeed, there's a levy on universities now. There's effectively a tax being levied on universities that charges them 6% of the fees they charge foreign students. So that's a little bit of a win for the Treasury. Lots and lots of things. I think generally an acceptance that they will have an effect on the net migration numbers. But Keir Starmer, although he said he expected the numbers to come down, wouldn't commit, as previous Tory prime ministers have, to some sort of specific target or trying to get immigration down to below, say, 100,000, which is what David Cameron used to talk about. I mean, I'm right in saying, Ed, this is the big throw of the dice by this government on legal migration, because we're only 3-4 years away from a general election. If you think about it, this all has to be turned. It's a white paper. It's going to be turned into legislation. It's got to go through Parliament. It's got to be implemented. So it's probably not even going to start to bite for a year or two, if you're lucky. And if this doesn't work, the kind of chance work in their own terms of getting migration down, then really time will have run out on this government.
The numbers during the period when we were in government and then when you were in government at the Treasury were higher for legal migration than they had been in previous decades, in the low hundreds of thousands. David Cameron, when he became Prime Minister, made that commitment to try and get it back into the tens of thousands, because legal migration had been 150, 200,000 through that period. That actually kind of carried on at those kind of numbers. It was very hard for him to meet the objective he had set. But of course, then we had, after Brexit, in the Boris Johnson period, a big rise in legal migration. I mean, a huge rise to, up to close to 1 million. That's now on its way down, partly because of some of the tightening which we saw from the previous Conservative Home Secretary, James Cleverly. And what the government is doing is taking that further, accelerating some of the things he was doing, bringing in other kind of restrictions on, for example, numbers coming in to work in the UK from social care, as you said, on definitions around kind of the skill level you have to be at to come into the country. I think the interesting thing is, for me, when I look at the language about the importance of control, of there not being a free market, of requiring companies to invest in the skills of British workers, there's actually quite a lot of continuity with the language that Gordon Brown was using as Prime Minister at the end of the first decade of the 2000s, when he talked about British jobs for British workers and the importance of investing in skills. Quite a lot of continuity in what you and David Cameron were doing, obviously without free movement because we're outside the EU. If you look at the speeches that Ed Miliband made as Leader of the Opposition, I made as Shadow Chancellor, Yvette Cooper as Shadow Home Secretary, 2013, 2014, they were all about what Labour would do to control immigration. Very consistent with the policy, much of the language which we saw in this week's white paper. And in a way, this has been the story of migration policy over the last few decades. You have periods where a decision occurs, which people don't always understand at the time, but leads to a substantial rise in immigration. That's what happened with Tony Blair, with the enlargement in 2004. And then you are then trying to get back control in the system. Boris Johnson lost control. Conservatives and now Labour trying to get back control again, always trying to make sure that you don't lurch too much in the opposite direction. You don't then make mistakes which contradict your own policy. I think there's a real question for Labour going into the European Union discussion next week as to whether the conversation on youth mobility, which I think is a sensible conversation to be having with our European partners, is going to push in the opposite direction in terms of managing migration to what the government was trying to do in its white paper. And but of course, the difference is now that you have an Office of Budget Responsibility, which is kind of marking the homework of governments, not just budget to budget, but almost policy measure to policy measure. Is this set of policies, which is intended to reduce migration, is it also going to have an impact upon growth in the economy? I think that's different to how things would have been when you were making policy. You didn't have like a rolling kind of OBR engagement in policy in quite the way that happens now.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say is true, that there is. I'll come on to the OBR point. That there's a lot of continuity. I mean, the sort of striking thing is that I think this white paper could have been produced by a Conservative government, and I think some people on the left will find that quite striking because, it's exactly
although not by the Boris Johnson.
No, I mean, I'll come back.
Absolutely not.
So there's this extraordinary thing that happens in British politics, which I still think has no real explanation, even though a lot of the participants in the decision are still in the shadow cabinet and leading the Conservative Party, which is Brexiteers win the referendum. They then win the leadership of the party with Boris Johnson, and then immigration rockets. It triples.
It's astonishing.
So it's a staggering event in British politics. No one really understands it until, of course, the people start to arrive. So, because it's all around decisions taken inside 10 Downing Street and the Home Office at the time around kind of routes for people to come in, particularly through the work route and the student visa and student visa dependence route. And suddenly you get almost 1 million people coming into the country when the country has voted for these very individuals running the country to reduce immigration. It's an amazing kind of mystery. And when you hear people asked about it, kind of leading Conservative politicians at the time, they go, "Oh, it wasn't me, Gov. I mean, I wasn't making those decisions. I don't know." And so it's a very interesting, like, no one owns up to it. And Kemi Badenoch, says it was one of the big mistakes of the Tory era, which we should acknowledge. But there's still no kind of reckoning of why it happened. But if you absent that period, which I'm not saying is not very significant, but if you take that kind of odd period of the Boris Johnson government out, what the Labour government is doing is very consistent with what Conservative governments had been doing over the coalition government. Basically making tweaks, tightening up the work route, the requirement on skills, the requirement, tightening up the sort of, avenues for students, trying to avoid abuse of dependents and so on. And I guess the question to you is, I've got two questions. We'll come on to the money and the economics. The first question is, I think if you were a kind of Nigel Farage person, you would be challenging us centrists here to say that's the whole problem, isn't it? Labour, Tory, it doesn't matter who's in. They talk this language about control, but, in the end, they're kind of fiddling at the margins. Okay, it's 18 months you can stay rather than 24 months. The amount the employer has to pay is like X thousand more, but you're not sort of closing the gates. You're not prepared to shut the door. And that's what the British people have consistently demanded of their politicians. And we've got another kind of centrist government that's not prepared to bite that bullet.
But the public do not want the door shut. That is absolutely what they don't want. They know we need to have skills and ideas, and they know British workers go and work abroad and people come and work in our country. What they want is control and grip. And I think a lot of the policy of the last 20 years has been trying to then re-establish control after control has been lost. And it was lost really because of free movement in Eastern Europe in the 2000s, and then because of as you say, the Boris Johnson massive incompetence post-Brexit. I think the interesting thing about Nigel Farage and the Conservatives is that they don't really have a diagnosis of what they think is wrong with what is being proposed here. I mean, if Nigel Farage was to say this is impossible without leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, if that was his response on the day, you could understand it. I think he's wrong. But he says, no, well, they don't really mean it. They don't care. It won't really work. But my sense is they do mean it, and they're pretty determined to make it work. And then the Conservatives say, oh, well, they're just stealing our clothes. But actually, it was the Conservatives in government which lost control of migration. It's very hard you've got Chris Philp saying they're aping us. Kemi Badenoch simultaneously saying we need to admit we lost control of migration in the last Conservative government. And then both Reform and the Conservatives say they're not really serious because they've not got a cap. A cap which, when they're then asked, well, what is this cap? They then say, well, actually, we can't tell you. We don't know what a cap would be at the moment, which slightly undercuts their argument at the moment. So, I'm not sure whether the government will be worried about the arguments being put by Reform and the Conservatives this week. They'll be worrying about whether the measures are going to work. And of course, the other thing which will be happening in the Treasury is they'll be worried about, as I said, what the OBR is going to say and the impact upon growth.
Well, so let's then come on to the economic impact of this. I mean, it has been a kind of, an assumption in the British state, often an argument that internally is made by the Treasury against the Home Office under whoever's in government, that if for every decision you take to restrict legal migration routes, particularly students and their ability to work in Britain after they've got their degree, and bringing in skilled migrants, every decision, or indeed bringing in unskilled seasonal workers to, for example, pick fruit in Kent, if every decision you take in that regard has an impact on GDP, and it has a kind of mechanical impact on GDP, because the more people you have in the country, the higher the GDP is, sort of mechanically. But also, I think the Treasury would argue it has an impact on productivity and then for GDP per head. And at the same time, I think critics of large-scale migration over the last 20 years, to be fair, and think tanks like Migration Watch that were set up to make this argument, and this was an argument heard in the Brexit referendum, was that this is a totally false calculation. It lets the country and employers off the hook of doing the hard work of skilling up British workers, British-born workers. We don't really believe these economic numbers. And I have to say, I thought it was interesting to see Yvette kind of wade into this argument. Of course, Yvette was a senior Treasury Minister in a previous government. She was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I imagine would have been making the arguments as Chief Secretary about why immigration is good for the British economy. But this was her response when she was doing an interview on the economic impact of what's been announced.
Do you accept that this is extra burden for business? In a free market, you want businesses to grow. They want to hire the people they need right now. And you're making that more complicated.
But if that approach was right, we would have seen, when we saw that soaring level of net migration, that soaring level of overseas recruitment, surely we would have seen soaring growth alongside it, and we didn't. Actually, what we saw was the economy flatline because by failing to invest in UK workers, that also undermines productivity, it undermines the ability to get people back into the work who are currently not working. So alongside those record highs of overseas recruitment, we also had this big increase in people just not working here in the UK.
I mean, this will be contentious. The Treasury will be disagreeing with that, and we'll see what the OBR say. But it's pretty hard to deny that the period in which legal net migration has been much higher from the mid-2000s for the following 20 years has been a period of unusually poor growth and productivity growth under, Gordon Brown, David Cameron and you, the Conservatives after Brexit as well. It's not only the last 4 years where you've had high levels of migration alongside historically disappointing growth.
Yes, although of course you don't know the counterfactual. You don't know what the growth would have been if we hadn't been bringing in lots of people into our country to fill those job vacancies. And it's also been a period historically, almost unique, I would say, in kind of modern British history of very low unemployment and skill shortages and labour shortages, which, if you hadn't brought these people in, who knows? I mean, let me just, on this kind of growth, I thought there was a very good column by Janan Ganesh this week in the FT, where he says Labour talks about prioritising the economy. That's been the language since the general election. But every time they're kind of required to actually make a choice, they don't choose the economy. So he's sort of calling out that language. He says, we choose the economy, but we also have to control our borders, and we have to tax our universities, and we're going to have to reduce the numbers of skilled workers coming into the country, or we talk about prioritising economy, but we're still going ahead with our net zero things despite the warnings of Tony Blair and the others. We talk about prioritising our economy, but Angela Rayner's introducing new burdens on business. And if you're explicitly saying immigration control is more important than economic growth, or if that's what the OBR is going to tell us, that's the choice. Isn't there some truth to that?
Well, look, it was pretty clear on Monday which side of the argument Keir Starmer's coming down on as Prime Minister. I think if you actually look at what the White Paper is saying, it's saying we need to have the kind of immigration which will be good for growth, but we also need to make sure that we don't do that in a way which stops companies doing the things they should be doing to invest in the skills of the British workforce. And we also need to control and manage the system so that it's not a free-for-all, which obviously has a political dimension to it, independent of the growth argument. But the politics of this week haven't really been about this growth argument, despite what Laura Kuenssberg was asking there. It's actually been about the way Keir Starmer set this up on Monday. And this is how Nick Robinson on the Today programme explained the language Keir Starmer used to describe the policy, and contrasting it with the language Keir Starmer himself was using about immigration just 4 or 5 years ago when he ran to be Labour leader.
What a difference a few years makes. Listen to Keir Starmer talking about immigration in 2020.
We welcome migrants. We don't scapegoat them. Low wages, poor housing, poor public services are not the fault of migrants and people who've come here. They're political failure. Political failure. So we have to make the case for the benefits of migration, the benefits of free movement.
Now listen to Sir Keir speaking yesterday. He spoke about the incalculable damage of mass immigration, talked of the need to take back control of our borders, argued that contrary to all the official economic models, immigration does not help the economy to grow. And
we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together.
I mean, let's start with this phrase, an island of strangers. Critics on the left have pointed out that there are some echoes of the language that Enoch Powell used around people becoming strangers in their own land because of mass migration. This is, some 50 years ago. I mean, first of all, do you think, Ed, let's start with the Enoch Powell thing. Do you think anyone writing that speech in Number 10 spotted that there might be a kind of parallel to Enoch Powell's language, or that was just like a cock-up?
Look, Keir Starmer is moving hour by hour from big issue to big issue. Had a very complicated weekend. You'll have known about all of the threats that he and his family were facing over the weekend to properties that they were living in. I have no idea. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Keir Starmer wasn't immediately seeing that reference. But the people who spend hours and hours and weeks preparing for these moments, I mean, you'd have to be pretty ignorant of British politics not to see that the using of that language was going to have that reaction. And it did have a big reaction. And I think partly the people who wrote that for Keir Starmer will have intended to have that reaction because, in modern politics...
Well, they wouldn't have intended... Sorry, let me just pick up. I think they definitely would have known that there would be lots of Labour MPs who weren't happy with the general language he was talking about, which is sort of take back control, fairness, people have to learn to speak English, they've got to commit to our society, immigration's a privilege, not a right, all that language. But the phrase and the use of the word strangers and the link to Enoch Powell, I can't believe those Number 10 speechwriters were deliberately doing that. Well, maybe they were.
Well, look, I have no idea. Maybe, as you say, it was inadvertent, although this is highly sensitive language and very unusual language to use. And it's what happens in politics when you're trying to get attention. If you think about, Theresa May, citizens of nowhere, David Cameron talking about swarms of migrants. Think about when you talked about strivers and shirkers. This was language which was designed to get attention, and you're
for the foreign land speech I wrote for William Hague as his speechwriter. That was
another.
I have to say, we didn't actually That's why I subscribe somewhat to the cock-up theory here, because when we were writing, Britain's turning into a foreign land, yes, I think you're fair to say we were trying to catch attention, but I don't think we anticipated back then that it would kind of set up this explosion. And I wonder whether they wanted to. Maybe if you're Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff, you go, yeah, great, okay, we didn't we wanted to have a row with the left on this. We're delighted that some of the left-wing Labour MPs, or indeed some of the Labour MPs who've been suspended and are independents, have come out and criticised it. I don't think they'll be particularly worried that, for example, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has come out and criticised language, or at least refused to repeat it. We should listen, shouldn't we? Because this is what Sadiq Khan said when he was challenged to repeat Keir Starmer's language.
How do you feel to hear a Labour Prime Minister talking about a squalid, that word squalid chapter, not an unacceptable chapter or an unreasonable or an unsustainable chapter, a squalid chapter and an island of strangers?
Well, those aren't words that I'd use.
There is no doubt that it will have caused a lot of consternation. And we've talked in the past about politics being about holding together your coalition. And this has a straining impact upon Keir Starmer's coalition. There've been lots of voices out criticising it, but they may think that's a price worth paying to get the message across. I think they will probably be less worried than about that. I do think when you listen to those two clips Nick Robinson played, the contrast of what Keir Starmer says in 2025 and what he said in 2020 is quite jarring. And proving that this is what you really believe and explaining why you've changed your mind so radically is an ongoing challenge for Keir Starmer. But in the end, the toughest thing for him now on this is delivery. I mean, he's put himself absolutely front and centre. He was tweeting today, I know you're angry about immigration. Mark my words, I will take back control of our borders. That means cutting migration, ending the use of asylum hotels, ramping up our efforts to stop small boat crossings. These are all really hard things to do. And if they are going to stop using asylum hotels, if they're going to clear the asylum backlog, if they're going to make sure that social care doesn't collapse as they would withdraw social care visas, I mean, there's a spending review coming up in a couple of months' time. The financial cost of really turning around the asylum system and making the social care system work in the UK with their international workers is going to be very big. And Keir Starmer says, this is what I'm going to do. And he said, trust me on this. I will deliver. And, it's going to have to.
Yeah, look, I think lots of pro-immigration politicians, if you can put it like that, including myself, not that I'm a politician anymore, have been on a bit of a journey. I think, we understand that we've not carried the country with us. And we can't just ignore the fact that there are a lot of people very, very concerned about integration into our communities and levels of immigration. Personally, I always thought that it wasn't free movement of labour from Europe that was causing a lot of that angst. But that became the first target, and we left the European Union. And now we've got all these other measures to try and restrict to some degree the numbers of people coming in. But no, none of the mainstream politicians who come at Time Point are actually prepared to say, look, we're not having any more. Okay, fine. No more people coming in to work. No more dependents. No more, no more students.
George, that is not that has never been what the public believe. The public have never wanted to shut the doors.
Are you sure that's not just wishful thinking?
Even when Nigel Farage talks about a cap, he's not saying zero. We know we need to have people who come with particular skills. We know our NHS needs it. What they need is control. And, go back to 2015 when we got lambasted for having a mug which put on the side, control immigration. I mean, the idea that now, 10 years on, controlling immigration is somehow seen as kind of being a bad thing. The public want us to control immigration. And the problem with free movement is it was a free market, free for all, which people felt was out of control. And I always think if you want to be in favour of immigration and the good things it can do, you've also got to be in favour of controls and fairness. And that was always the right place to be. And I think you are right that is where the consensus is now setting. And if there are kind of left voices saying we want to go back to free movement, I just think that ship has absolutely sailed politically.
Although, as you point out, we might have a bit of free movement for young people coming again with the European Union. But
Well, I think if they do that, that would be a big mistake. I don't think Keir Starmer can afford to have a tough message on migration in 1 week and then lurch in the opposite direction. They won't do that. They shouldn't do that. And I really hope that that's not what they've agreed.
And you don't think the public would distinguish between, 24-year-old Italian coming to work in Britain as a waiter and, a family from, Nigeria or India coming to settle permanently because the breadwinner in the family has got a job and passed the test for a permanent settlement?
I think that what the public want to know is that the government's got a grip on numbers and that they can deliver what they say, and that it's a good thing to have people come here to work temporarily if they are students, to and having a youth mobility scheme which allows people to come in and out of our country is a good thing. But it can't be an open-ended commitment for anybody who wants to come independent of the numbers. And that's, I think, the thing. A year ago, the European Union was saying there's no EU reset deal unless you have essentially free movement for under 30-year-olds. They can't agree to that after what Keir Starmer said.
I still come back to, one of Britain's great advantages in the world. It is a magnet for talented people from across the globe who want to move there. And actually, there are very few countries that are a place where everyone is, interested in moving who wants to leave their own country. Britain is one, America is another, and so on.
You are totally right. And our ability to be global in that way is undermined by our failures to manage migration properly over recent decades.
Okay. So then 2 final things before we conclude. First, do you think the language is just going to get more and more extreme in this space? If you look at American politics, I'm here in California, where immigration is a massive issue, mainly illegal immigration, although I've just been spending most of the week in Silicon Valley where they're having a fierce row about whether they should be sucking up all these talented engineers from around the world or going to the middle of America and training up the farm boys and the kids in the former industrial areas to become the kind of programmers of the future. The language here has moved on to kind of deportations and, walls and all of that. Of course, very sort of Trumpian language. Do you think we kind of, it's interesting even within the Reform Party in the UK, of course, the recent split, it's a bit like the, Life of Brian, the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front. But within Reform, there's been a split with some arguing that they should have tougher language. So do you think that's the direction we're heading in? And then I guess my second point is, what the white paper didn't really touch was the boats, illegal migration, the thing that Rishi Sunak now says was the biggest failure of his premiership. He's been here, by the way, at the same time as me in California. And do you see Keir Starmer, maybe the language is also, this is the beginning of a kind of ramping up of language, and does Labour touch the ECHR and this whole, the convention that basically makes it quite hard for Britain to return people who've come to this country claiming asylum, which is the final one of the routes we've been discussing to get yourself into Britain legally?
I don't think there is any possibility of this Labour government advocating leaving the ECHR, but that doesn't mean that you can't express more clearly the will of Parliament to the courts about how the law should be enacted. And that is Parliament's role, to kind of give that very clear message to the judicial system. Keir Starmer himself looked forward to further moves on the way in which we manage asylum, and to have some signals in there. There's clearly been lots of conversations publicly talked about with the Italians and trying to learn from their experience, but that is not the same as handing over the responsibility to manage your asylum system to a foreign country, which is what the Rwanda scheme is about. But I would think that is not the end of the story on that. And on the language, the thing, we talked about this last week when we were talking about the local elections, the thing which Labour voters who are reform-minded want is action on the economy and delivery, but they're actually alienated, the polling says, by culture war language, the kind of thing which goes down well with reform voters who've never voted Labour in the past. And so to start using that more Trumpian language when it alienates reform-minded Labour voters and absolutely alienates those Labour voters who might be inclined to go to the Greens or the Lib Dems, that is not the right thing to do. And that is why, I don't think you'll see that from Labour and the government, that big escalation in language, because I just think it's not in the government's political interest to do that. But, we'll see. We can monitor this in the weeks and months to come.
Yeah, there's one thing's for sure. The immigration issue is not going away in British politics, although we haven't actually followed the route of Donald Trump, who has this week granted asylum to the white Afrikaners who are fleeing the ANC government in South Africa. I don't know if you've been following that at all in Britain, but it's created quite a big row here in the United States, that the only group of people that Donald Trump wants to let into the country are the white Afrikaners. Anyway, we'll move on from immigration to Donald Trump's big visit to the Middle East and that new gift he's just received, a gift called Air Force One. And we will talk about that next.
So Donald Trump is midway through his 4-day trip to the Gulf. You might think his trip would have been about foreign policy, because so much turmoil and instability in the Middle East at the moment, kind of dealing with the consequences of that revolutionary change in Syria, the ongoing kind of tensions in Israel and in Gaza. But in fact, on the way in, much of his rhetoric was about the deals he was going to do, the business deals he was going to do with Saudi Arabia. And much of the trip has been overshadowed, I think, in American politics by this row about his plane.
Yeah, I mean, this is full on Donald Trump, isn't it? I mean, you feel he's in his element. He's got on a jet. He's gone to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and he's on his way to Abu Dhabi. He has brought the cream of American business with him, not unlike his inauguration. He's able to bring not just Elon Musk, but Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, and the guy who created NVIDIA, the big chip manufacturer, Jensen. And, he's parading these people around, and he is signing these deals. He's shaking hands with hundreds of sheikhs. He's being treated like, royalty, the royalty I suspect he would rather like to be. I think in sort of commercial terms, it's always hard. I mean, I was a bit skeptical of the numbers on these big trips, because I remember when we did them, you're obviously trying to create the biggest possible number, and departments in Britain would be told to kind of, what's the biggest possible price tag we can put on this successful trip to India or successful trip to Vietnam or China or whatever. But he is claiming to have done almost $200 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. He's just been in Qatar. He's sold $200 billion of Boeing planes. And there has been all this business being done around AI data centers with these titans of the US sort of tech sector as well. So I think from Donald Trump's point of view, he won't really care about the rows about the Trump family's enrichment and the gift. It's an amazing story. I think everyone listening to this podcast will know it, but we'll just mention it in case you have been on Mars for the last week. But Qatar is offering, or has given, America Air Force One. And there's a history to this. The Air Force One that's being used at the moment, the Boeing jet that everyone's very familiar with, has been in service since 1990. So it's actually a very old plane. And every attempt to get a new one, which previous presidents have tried, has run into the sand of being far too expensive, and the Congress saying it's a waste of money, and Biden and Obama and Bush all backing down. And not unlike when Gordon Brown cancelled Blair Force One, if you remember. And Trump said, yeah, great, let these guys are giving it to us for free. Of course, the sting in the tail is that Trump gets to keep it when he stops being president. Here we should cover. Let's listen to Donald Trump defending this decision.
I think that was a very nice gesture. Now, I could be a stupid person and say, oh, no, we don't want a free plane. We give free things out. We'll take one, too. And it helps us out because, again, we're talking about we have 40-year-old aircraft. The money we spend, the maintenance we spend on those planes to keep them tippy-top is astronomical. You wouldn't even believe it. So I think it's a great gesture from Qatar. I appreciate it very much. I would never be one to turn down that kind of an offer. I mean, I could be a stupid person and say, no, we don't want a free, very expensive airplane.
But hang on, Donald. There is a reason why you should turn it down, which is that it is completely illegal. It's actually against the US Constitution for the American president to accept such a gift from a foreign power. I mean, he was actually on Fox News. He was saying, look at our current Air Force One. It's so much smaller, less impressive. My attitude is, why wouldn't I accept a gift? Well, because it's against the law. And he then says, this was 2:50 in the morning. He posted from Riyadh. The Boeing 747 has been given to the United States Air Force, not to me, he wrote. Why should our military and therefore our taxpayers be forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars when they can get it for free? Only a fool would not accept this gift on behalf of our country. But one, it's against the law, and it's also untrue because he's actually going to keep it when he stops being president. It's going to go to the Trump Library. I don't think it's going to sit in some library being visited like Elvis's plane in Graceland. Donald Trump is going to be flying around the country. At the same time, he is selling his cryptocurrency, which is a cryptocurrency which the family get a cut from every crypto they sell. And the incentive is you can come on a special tour of the White House and meet Donald Trump if you buy his coin. I mean, it's kleptocratically corrupt.
You've forgotten the 18-hole Trump golf course that is opening in Qatar as well. That Trump Jr. has been negotiating. The only thing is it certainly ups the bar, doesn't it, on gifts you need to give to the foreign leader. I mean, do you remember the row when Barack Obama came to London and Gordon Brown someone in Gordon Brown's office went to some considerable thought about what to give the new American president and came up with a kind of pen holder that had been carved from the wood of a Royal Navy ship that had helped end the slave trade. And then Obama in return gave Gordon a DVD box set. And it was like the British press, had fun with that. And I remember with David Cameron visiting America when the American president was there was like quite a lot of thought, and it would actually involve the Prime Minister having to spend quite a lot of time thinking, well, what's the gift we're going to give? And the British press pack were, always intrigued by what we would do. And I have to say, I don't remember any meeting where we were offering to provide a Boeing jet to the president.
But the reason is because we still have effective parliamentary and judicial scrutiny of the executive. And the problem in America is you have a supine Congress and a Supreme Court, which has essentially been quasi-neutered by Trump appointments. And it's not at all clear exactly where the legal challenge comes from things which are so kind of obviously unconstitutional. But that is the broader story of the Trump presidency. We did talk, though, when we were discussing Donald Trump a few months ago when he started, we did wonder whether in foreign policy, he could surprise us. Would we see, a Nixon to China moment with Iran? Was he going to put the squeeze on Netanyahu? And so far, I don't think there's any sign that he is. What he said about taking away sanctions and then meeting the new leadership in Syria is interesting. I'm not sure. We'll see in the next 24 hours after our podcast comes out. So far, it doesn't feel like this is the breakthrough movement on Iran, but he's obviously he's not playing ball with Israel. He's not actually visiting Israel on this trip.
Yeah, so I think if you are making the case for Donald Trump, you would say that the big foreign policy success of his first presidency was something called the Abraham Accords, which was essentially a peace deal between some of the Gulf states, particularly Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, and Israel. And they had historically never been prepared to sign that. And there was hope until the Hamas massacres that Saudi Arabia was going to join those Abraham Accords. And I think even Trump's kind of worst critics would say Abraham Accords not bad. not a bad achievement. And I think if you look, so that for all the row about the Qatari gift of Air Force One, and for all the kind of razzmatazz of the big business deals, and frankly, American presidents in the past have done big arms deals to Saudi Arabia, and there've been promises of big kind of Gulf investment in the US before. There has been some pretty striking foreign policy done this week, and we'll come back to Israel because that's obviously the big missing piece. Although Trump did secure the release of the last American Israeli hostage this week at the beginning of the trip. But he started the week by securing a ceasefire from the Houthis. These are the Yemeni rebels who've been firing missiles at Red Sea shipping, and that's been putting up the price of lots of goods on our shelves because it's forced ships to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and South Africa rather than through the Suez Canal. He is, and remember, Keir Starmer and previous Tory governments were doing airstrikes against the Houthis and nothing was working. But he seems to have secured a ceasefire on that front. He has restarted the Iranian negotiations. This is to stop Iran getting a nuclear bomb. And in fact, seems to be proposing something pretty similar to the Obama deal, which he himself tore up all those years ago. But nevertheless, he's engaging directly with Iran in talks through his negotiator, this guy, Steve Witkoff, who was like a kind of business pal of his, who's now the kind of chief US Sherpa on these things. And he has taken a big step, which is this week he met in Riyadh the new president of Syria. This is a former jihadist who other leaders wouldn't meet. And I can't imagine many other presidents would have at this point so early on been prepared to meet. And he has lifted sanctions on Syria, sanctions that have been in place since 1979. This is not just the recent civil war. These were the sanctions originally imposed on Assad's father way back in the 1970s. That's obviously going to be a huge boost for the Syrian economy, which has been frozen out of the world system for decades. And, what he's asking for in return is that Syria, A, doesn't become a haven of terrorism, which is he's asking the former terrorist leader to deliver on. And secondly, he's saying you've got to sign these Abraham Accords too. And if he pulls that all off, and it's a big if, we don't know. And by the way, he might stop off on the way back in Istanbul with Zelensky and Putin to kind of negotiate the Ukraine war. He's very, very active. He's very personal, and he's prepared to take risks in terms of meeting people that I think other presidents, their teams would have said, you can't meet the jihadi leader of Syria. He says, I don't care.
I agree with you on Syria. Are you sure on Iran this is real? I'm not sure whether...
We don't know.
Do people really know what's in Trump's mind?
We don't. Remember when the first time Trump was president, he killed the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in a missile strike while that person was in Iraq. Everyone was shocked. It was a kind of brutal act of assassination, but it did completely decapitate the capacity of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and as most people now think was a very, very effective counterattack on Iran. So we just don't know. And the kind of big missing piece is Israel, isn't it? I mean, Trump has doubled down on America's support for the Netanyahu government in terms of aid, military assistance. Do you remember under the Biden administration, there were regular complaints from the Biden administration about the Israelis choking off aid in Gaza. Biden tried to create a kind of military, a kind of artificial harbor in Gaza so that aid could be delivered directly. And that was a bit of a fiasco because they couldn't get the harbor to work. So Trump has not done any of that, but he has also got quite a spiky relationship with Netanyahu.
He does.
Who he doesn't really trust.
And the truth is that this hostage release, the American hostage release, piles much more pressure onto Netanyahu. And,
Why do you say that?
Well, because, I think the evidence is that was not something that Israel was aware was going to happen until it was announced. And clearly in domestic Israeli politics, the fact that Netanyahu has not managed to secure so many of the remaining Israeli hostages is, if Trump can do it, why can't Netanyahu?
I mean, it's worth perhaps ending this section on the deteriorating situation in Gaza, a kind of growing concern about the, essentially the sealing off again of the population of Gaza and the access to food and medicine. And I thought there was a good Matthew Paris column this week, just saying, why is British politics not talking about Gaza anymore? And when we were doing this podcast a year ago, we were talking a lot about concerns inside the Labour Party about Gaza, some of the language Starmer had used that was, kind of inflammatory with the left. And then it has sort of gone silent. And yet,
yes, but I think
sort of resurfacing, isn't it, as an issue?
I think actually until today, Ed Davey used his PMQ to raise this issue with the Prime Minister. The day started on the Today programme with a friend of this podcast, somebody we both worked with in the past, Tom Fletcher, who's now the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, making this very stark warning at the UN. And, if in domestic politics people are thinking that this issue has gone away, I think it hasn't.
I can tell you from having visited what's left of Gaza's medical system that death on this scale has a sound and a smell that does not leave you. As one hospital worker described it, children scream as we peel burnt fabric from their skin. And yet we hear that we did all we could. Mr. President, our response as humanitarians is to make a single ask of the Council. Let us work. The UN and our partners are desperate to resume humanitarian aid at scale across Gaza, in line with the fundamental principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality.
So you think this issue is coming back? I mean, it's obviously a real issue for the people on the ground in Gaza, but is it coming back into British politics?
I think it will. I think it is. I think those words are very powerful. I think the failure to make progress either on the ceasefire or on the flow of humanitarian aid will get increasing attention. And I think if you were Keir Starmer, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, you will be very focused on trying to get some movement here, because I think it's not gone away.
Although, would you be using? I'm just going to pick you up on this. You've got that Britain's role in this is pretty limited, and you've got that limited bandwidth with Trump. And there's no doubt Starmer does have a working relationship with Trump, and Trump appears to listen to him, and he secured that trade deal last week. But you've got to, you're trying to get further action on trade with the US. You're worried about the US's disengagement from Ukraine or pressure on Zelensky. Are you going to use that 10-minute phone call to the White House to also raise Gaza?
I think you have to think about the different ways in which issues impact. And you are right that what is happening with Russia and Ukraine is probably on our doorstep the biggest kind of threat to peace and stability in our generation in Europe. And you are right, if you're Rachel Reeves and the government worrying about what's going to happen to the economy, that what Donald Trump is doing on tariffs is a huge kind of risk and danger, and therefore you'd be putting a lot of your focus there. And it may be that your leverage on those two issues, if you're Keir Starmer, is greater. But I think in terms of kind of public sentiment, and in particular, Labour thinking about the integrity of its coalition and keeping voters who voted for it last year from not slipping away to the Greens and to the Liberal Democrats, I think that to give any impression that you were kind of downgrading the importance of what was happening in Gaza would be really, really risky. And I think in opposition, they made that mistake before, and I don't think they'll want to make it again.
So to be continued there. Anyway, one thing I'm sure that Keir Starmer or our ambassador, Peter Mandelson in Washington, will be raising is Trump's announcement that despite the retreats on tariffs across the board, he is going to impose a new tariff of 100% on the production of American movies outside of where I am here, which is Los Angeles and Hollywood and the United States. So the recent trend over the last 10, 20 years of making these big American blockbusters in places like Britain, Trump says he's going to stop it. We are one of the most affected countries, and we are going to turn to that as our final topic today.
There we are. That's all for Political Currency. We'll be back on Monday for ex-ministers' questions.
Yes, do of course keep sending questions into EMQs at questions@politicalcurrency.co.uk and sign up to be a Political Currency Gold subscriber, or even better, a Kitchen Cabinet member, and be part of our inner production team.
See you soon.
See you.